Thank you everybody for attending this webinar on advocacy tactics and messaging. The webinar today will be presented by Emma Stewart from PATH. Please keep questions to the end. At the end of the webinar, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. Please write in the chat box or ask to be given the presenter role. So Emma, now it's up to you.
Great, thank you, Sabine, and thanks for joining. As Sabine mentioned, my name is Emma Stewart, and I'm a Policy and Advocacy Officer at PATH. Just a little bit about PATH. PATH is a leader in global health innovation. We're an international nonprofit organization seeking to save lives and improve health, especially among women and children, by accelerating innovation across 5 platforms: vaccines, drugs, diagnostics, devices, and system and service innovations. We also serve as the Secretariat for the Coalition for Access to NCD Medicines and Products, which is how I'm joining you today. So I think I'm doing this correctly. Okay, great. We're going to try a couple technology-related things, and I'm hoping they'll work out. So throughout the webinar, I'm hoping to use an interactive polling application called Mentimeter, so that we can have some interactive time during the webinar in addition to the Q&A at the end. So I'll switch the screen over here and ask you to open another web browser without closing the one that you're currently watching the webinar on. And once you have a browser open, go to www.menti.com, so MENTI.com. And that when you're there, you should see the opportunity to enter a code. And our code will be 327569. And once you do that, you should be able to answer the question on the screen. So this is just a test to get us started, see if this is going to work for us. And the question is, what country are you joining the webinar from? So I'll give you a second, and hopefully people are able to open a new browser, and then either on the computer or tablet or phone that you're watching this on, or you could also do it on a phone as well. Great, so at least one person has successfully entered that they're calling in from the Faroe Islands. We have someone from Ireland on the line. Give it a second or two more just so we can all get accustomed. And as we go through this, so we'll be using the interactive software, and to see the results, you'll need to toggle back to the screen where the webinar is showing for you. So we'll all be kind of kept on our toes throughout. So maybe give folks just a minute or two more to see if you can enter where you're joining the webinar from. So I'm going to go back to the presentation now, and we'll see if we can get some more responses as we move through the content. So today I'm going to talk to you about selecting the right advocacy tactics and messages, and these are 2 of the 10 steps in PATH's Guide to Advocacy Strategy. We often share this information through an in-person multi-day training. So today I'm going to take you through some of the content, try and do some of those exercises virtually like we just tried on Mentimeter. And then also some of the slides can serve as references or templates for you to come back to. So I won't go through them as in depth, but hopefully when the webinar recording goes out to everyone. It can be accompanied with the slides, and you can use them as a reference. They're typically part of our workbook that we use for the multi-day training. Okay, so let's see if we can do this again. And it looks like we have someone from Belgium also joining. So I'm going to advance to the next slide here and hope you can come to Menti, www.menti.com, and see the question using our code 327569. So to talk effectively about messaging and tactics, it's important to first understand our audience. And when we think about advocacy, we often talk about decision makers and influencers. So I'm wondering if people are able to share who they think decision makers are in their context. Okay, so ministers are one. And unlike the previous question, if you have more than one idea, please feel free to enter more than one. And as you're thinking, I wanted to share that decision makers are often people with the formal power or authority to take the desired policy action, and this would include their key advisors or staff. So we have ministers, politics and government, government at large, mayors and the like. Public image, that's interesting, yeah. We might also think about folks who are at lower levels of government, such as county or provincial governors, local council members, and also people who have maybe a more specialized expertise, like ministers of finance, ministers of health, others that you might need to get their buy-in. In addition to decision makers, we want to think about who are the influencers, or the people or groups that can have a compelling force on the actions, opinions, or behaviors of the decision makers. So what types of people are influencers in your context? Who might have influence over some of the decision makers we listed previously? So members of parliament, the government, who are they influenced by? Some influencers that we often talk about are professional associations, journalists, family, that's an important one, other civic leaders, civil society organizations, great. Business associations in addition to professional associations, other academics sometimes who are able to provide information or evidence, also technical staff who work on issues related to the issue that you're interested in. And as you think through this in your own context when you're working on your tactics and messages, be sure to be as specific as possible. So we try not to say the general public, because that's often quite broad and difficult for us to get our arms around. So it's better to identify a specific journalist or a single news outlet or a community action group by name to whom we know the decision maker pays close attention. So I'm going to switch back over to the slides here. And here I have a list. This is one of the reference points that I was mentioning that you can come back to of both decision makers and influencers that might be relevant in your context. So once we know who they are, what do we need to know about decision makers and influencers, or as we often call them, champions, in order to effectively target them? So on the left-hand side here, I have 5 criteria that we like to consider, and on the right, some additional food for thought as you're thinking through each of these 5 dimensions. So the first is awareness. how much does my decision maker know about the issue already? They might be unaware, they might be aware but inaccurately informed, they might be aware and mostly uninformed, or they might have great information and be fully aware of the issue. So all things to consider in terms of what information or evidence might need to be provided. We also like to talk about what are their motivations and beliefs. What motivations or beliefs does my decision maker hold relevant to this topic? So you might consider their personal experience, financial considerations, constituent viewpoints, upcoming political considerations like elections are all things that motivate decision makers to act. We also consider what are their pain points. So what might prevent them from taking the action we want them to? And understanding this is also really critical to deploying the right tactics and the right messages. We're also going to talk a little bit later about messengers, and so it's important to think about who influences my decision maker, whose opinion do they respect, and am I able to influence that person who will in turn influence the decision maker. Finally, we like to consider where they get their information from, particularly around health and policy issues. So do they rely on media outlets, one-on-one meetings, other events? Where are we most likely to have the opportunity to inform the decision maker? If we're targeting the media and a specific decision maker, we want to make sure we're targeting outlets that they're paying attention to. So all of these things are critical to know, and it's nice to kind of do this up front when considering a champion, and it'll help some of your other decisions down the line flow a bit more easily. A couple of key points that I wanted to make is that people care most about an issue when it aligns with their key interests. So understanding what your champion cares most about will help you design the tactics and messages that are more persuasive and compelling. And remember, it's about their key interests and not yours. So we can't assume that people will always care about an issue for the same reasons we do, and they might be motivated to act for very different reasons. Understanding all of this is going to be really critical. One other point to make is that we want to focus on the people that we can persuade. Too often, advocates spend a lot of time responding to opposition or persuading champions who are already on your side. Instead, we should target those who might be on the fence, but could support our issue if they have a little bit more thoughtful outreach to them. And remember, there's more potential for movement in the middle than at either extreme end of the decision spectrum. So these are dimensions that we consider, and this is one way that we do that. Here I have a slide where we have the policy goal at the top. We include that there so we can keep it front of mind. We want to remember that an advocacy goal should be clear and concise and include the who, what, when, and how. And then in relation to that goal, we want to evaluate those 5 dimensions. We want to think specifically about this goal instead of the broader issue to get to the heart of what motivations, pain points, et cetera. It'll really help us narrow in. So you may have a decision maker who's a champion for diabetes treatment in general, but they may or may not yet have an opinion on your advocacy goal about increasing affordability of EMTs. So rather than framing it as diabetes treatment, we want to narrow in on that affordability of EMTs question to really get to the heart of the issue. So here I've put together an example. The policy goal here is the National Department of Health will release an administrative order mandating coordinated action among national and provincial health departments in screening, preventing, and treating NCDs by June 2018. And the decision maker in this context is a member of Parliament, Honorable Zaragamba. We know that she has limited awareness. She believes strongly in a limited role for government. She's new to Parliament and has many demands on her time. She's often persuaded by facts and influence, and she subscribes to major newspapers, but she prefers in-person meetings with constituents. So this is just an example of how you might take those 5 dimensions that we considered on the last screen and really contextualize it for a specific goal and a specific decision maker. And I've included this template as one of the templates that you can come back to when you're looking at your own issue. So once we have our champions, our decision makers and influencers in mind, we want to think about what tactics will most likely inform them. It's best to limit the number of strategic actions you take based on your resources and your capacity. You cannot and should not try to do everything in advocacy. So we want to focus on tactics that are most likely to have an immediate and direct impact on your target decision makers or key influencers. So when we do this training in person, we use what we call a carousel activity to brainstorm ideas that you can use in each of these 5 categories that describe tactics. So we're going to try something similar using Mentimeter for each of the 5 tactics that we're looking at: traditional and new media, events and meetings, materials and publications, monitoring commitments and promoting accountability, and gathering evidence for advocacy. So if you'll join me back over on Menti, we can see if we can brainstorm along these 5 major categories of tactics to get some ideas that we might use going forward. So what are some examples you can think of traditional and new media that might work? So traditional media is typically radio, newspapers, that kind of thing. New media might include some more social media, and so Twitter, Facebook. So I see someone saying Instagram, I think newspaper, Snapchat. That's interesting to consider how we might use those new media techniques. We also have radio, TV, written press. We have a letter to the editor. An internet advertisement, that's great, yeah. A press release is another idea. That would be another kind of traditional media technique. Any other final examples of, event promotion? Great. I think that actually ties us nicely to our next one, which is, let me see if I can get there. Yeah. What are some examples of types of events or meetings that might work in order to influence our decision makers and influencers? So member events or a panel. Professional conferences, that's great. Exhibits. I think we can think of awareness campaigns, great. So we want to think about events and meetings that we're familiar with, I think, but also in our advocacy, we have some opportunities to stretch and think of either new or creative ways to capture the attention of an influencer or a decision maker. Workshops are a great one to really get people familiar with the content of an issue. Some, I know, maybe along the lines of awareness campaigns, some places I've seen kind of marches or walks, parades, that kind of thing in support of a health issue area. You might think of a flash mob, great, that could get some excitement and energy around an issue. We also have some of the more standard ideas, that, maybe a report launch, or you could go with interactive games or campaigns. I was somewhere in an event recently that had a lot of interactive games that were really thoughtful about raising awareness of their particular health issue, and I thought that was really useful. Some of the messages stuck a bit more than a typical kind of more stale event. So if we move to the next tactic bucket, we want to think about what are some materials and publications that we might produce that would be useful for our champions to consider. So we have a poster, journal article. What other types of materials? So I think materials and publications often go hand in hand with events and meetings and things like that. So you might think of what are some of the written pieces that you would want to have on hand at an event. You also can reach out directly through a letter. That sounds like a great idea in terms of having something in writing for a decision maker. Brochures, that would be great. An overview of your issue, including any of your key asks, along with results from the research. That's a great thing to share, especially we know that our decision maker here is persuaded by facts and evidence. So ensuring that that's available when they're making decisions is a good idea. Some other ideas that we talk about a lot are what's something really brief and high level that someone could look at quickly. So something like a fact sheet or a 2-pager. Infographic really fits for that, kind of with a brief document that encapsulates your issue. I also see someone has added community survey results. I think particularly when we're targeting decision makers who are directly influenced by what their constituents are thinking, we would want to share kind of as much community data as possible. So all great ideas for materials and publications. The next kind of suite of tactics I like to think of as monitoring commitments and promoting accountability. So that's a little bit more, maybe a little bit more difficult to understand. So when we're thinking about this, some examples that I have to share are maybe a citizen report card, so that kind of goes along with community survey results. Public expenditure tracking. These are going to be a little bit more technical in nature, but if you're interested in resource mobilization around your issue, you might think about tracking what has been spent to date. We have processes like participatory budgeting, where constituents can show up and input into what goes into a budget. That might be an opportunity to promote accountability. I don't know if others have other ideas. This one for me is a little bit more difficult to come up with front of mind because it's not as common as, you know, an event or something. So finance reports are great. I think citizen report cards is a tactic we've seen. So if you're targeting multiple decision makers, you might show them how others are faring on your issue. Yeah. So let's maybe move to the last group, which is gathering evidence for advocacy. So what are some of the ways that you can gather evidence that might inform some of these other written pieces or events that you might host? So Google Forms, that's a great way to collect evidence. A focus group is kind of similar, but if you were to do that in person. Surveys, great. A study tour, that could be interesting, especially if there's kind of a disconnect between your decision maker and the issue, if they really can experience it firsthand from the perspective of constituents who are going through it. Written complaints Yeah, that's important to kind of collate those so they can see a kind of the depth of people who are concerned about your issue. Testimonies, great, that's a good idea. We also have modeling here. I think that's important. I think when we're thinking about our policy goals, they're future facing, and so we want to bring in evidence that might model what that looks like, either from if you were looking at a communicable disease, either disease transmission modeling. You can also look at budget modeling. Information comparing systems and results is important to have as well. All great examples of evidence that we might want to gather. And so I think, so this worked out nicely for me in terms of gathering that feedback. So if we go back to the slides here, I've included for reference some other lists, some of which we talked about, some will be in addition to the things that we listed. But these are sourced over time through the workshops that we do and experiences that we have. So there's one of these slides for each of the 5 areas. I wanted to go a little bit more in depth on new media because I think that's something that's often really accessible to us. And so I pulled together some tips for maximizing our social media use. And these are adapted from a blog at the bottom there on Twitter, but I think they apply across most platforms. So when you're thinking about raising issue awareness or reaching out and being part of a broader dialogue, one thing that you can do is target influencers, so you can be sure to link to them and engage directly with influencers in your area. Also, using hashtags is really important, so someone who might have a little bit of interest in an area can easily find your content. This one I found interesting. It's about timing, and so some studies or some user research found that the best time to post on Twitter is at 3 p.m. during the week. And so maybe that's when people have a bit of a slump at work or are getting out of school, depends on the context. But thinking about if you have content that you really want to share, can it wait until kind of the afternoon where you're most likely to have it be seen? Another thing to consider is for your own social media accounts, as you're thinking of yourself as an advocate, make sure that you're conveying information so that if somebody does see your tweet or your post, that they're able to kind of understand your relationship to the issue and understand conveying your personality as well. I think that's helpful in terms of becoming more relatable and known in the area. Another thing to consider is to use images when you have them. So posts with photos are more likely to grab attention and get people to stop and read the content. So if you have a compelling photo or image to include, that's useful. And then the last thing to consider is focusing on quality over quantity. I think we want to make sure that we're writing and editing well before we post so that you can really convey your message as clearly as possible. So those were tips that I found helpful in thinking through how we might use social media to share some of our advocacy messages. And then here we have the slides, like I said, for reference for you to come back to. I mentioned that for events and meetings, we can sometimes think more broadly and outside of the box, and some of these ideas convey that as well. So a photo exhibit or a film festival, those are a little bit more dynamic events. So when I mentioned that where there were interactive games, which someone said, they also had a film that they were showcasing about their issue area. You could also look at kind of tried and true ones like a parliamentary briefing, a stakeholder briefing, a luncheon, that kind of thing, report launch, ones that we know have been used in the past to work as well. Here's some additional ideas for materials and publications. So you might think about putting together some PowerPoint slides that you can use about your specific policy ask going forward, talking points, infographics. A lot of these are really kind of short in nature because you might not have the attention of a decision maker for very long, but having something that either you can hand them or they can come back to is often really useful when they do have a bit more time. This was, again, the one about monitoring commitments and promoting accountability. So I read through most of these when we were brainstorming, but health committees, citizen charters, that kind of thing might be useful in engaging the community a bit more, especially if you're looking at accountability on issues that have already gained some traction. Finally, we have some ideas for how to gather evidence for your advocacy. A couple of these we talked about, modeling, that kind of thing, focus groups. Collecting stories can often be really compelling, in addition to doing some of the more research-oriented, like a lit review or a policy and budget analysis. So depending, again, on those, on what motivates your decision maker or what information they're most swayed by, you might think about which of these types of evidence might resonate most with that decision maker. So when you're choosing from this long menu of tactics that we just went through, make sure you consider, do they address my decision maker's interests? Will they help lessen the influence of any opposing groups? Do I or my team or my colleagues have the expertise and resources to carry out the activity? You won't want to put on a film festival if you don't have a film or you can't produce one. And then what other upcoming events or dates or government decisions could be opportunities to mobilize for advocacy? So if you're planning an event around a budget ask, you might think about where that falls in the government's budget cycle. Or if there's new evidence coming out, you might use that as an opportunity to host an event. So really thinking through kind of opportunistic moments that you could capitalize on to really build momentum for your issue is important. So now that we know what our tactics are, could be, I wanted to talk a little bit about how to ensure our messages are likely to compel decision makers to take action. So an advocacy message translates your advocacy goal into a concise and compelling case for a decision maker to act on. We like to think about this as having 4 key parts. So 1, what is the issue? Next, why should the decision maker care? What is the proposed solution and how will it impact the problem? And finally, what should the decision maker specifically do? So these 4 parts can be tailored to your specific issue, and most times you won't be able to deliver your message without interruption. So keeping just this 4-part framework in mind will help you remain on message, not become distracted, and be concise and compelling when sharing your message with interested parties. So what do I mean by compelling? We like to think about the 4 parts of that message should be no more than 5 to 8 sentences and should take less than 3 minutes to deliver. So that's a really good frame of reference in terms of how much you can fit into your message. We want to make sure they're focused messages, that they're solution-oriented, they're supported by evidence, even though you might save any facts or figures for a follow-up discussion. You want to capture the decision maker's interest first, so maybe not getting too far into the evidence in that high-level message. We want to make sure that we're reflecting the why you should care part of the message specifically to the decision maker in front of you. So again, going back to your list of what their key interests are, making sure that you're targeting directly to them will be useful in getting traction from your message. We want to make sure to avoid technical language because it's not usually accessible to folks who aren't yet familiar with your issue. And we want to remain optimistic and hopeful that change can happen and that we have a solution that will work. You want to make sure you always conclude your message with a request to take a very clear, specific action to advance the policy goal. And most policymakers won't be likely to achieve your entire goal as a result of one meeting. So request an achievable immediate step in terms of being kind of managing what's possible. And then make sure a couple like housekeeping things would be, don't forget to say thank you and be respectful. They've given you some time and you want to be appreciative of that, more likely to get a future meeting as well. So here are some sample messages that might serve as reference when you come back to craft your own. You want to make sure that they're clear and concise. Again, these ones are very short, they're high level, but again, maybe no more than 5 to 8 sentences if you were to get a little bit more in depth. But these, again, are just for reference. And when you come back to this, you might think about which of these most resonates with you and why, and if your particular decision maker would be swayed by any of these, and kind of model your asks off of that. Here I have a template that we use to build that 4-part advocacy message. So again, right up front, you want to make sure you're targeting a specific decision maker, and you can reference what their key interest is to keep that in mind when you go through the 4 parts. So what's the issue? Why should they care? What's the proposed solution? And what do you want them to do? So you can kind of brainstorm in those 4 center boxes and then combine those 4 parts into a compelling message below. So again, a template that we often use for putting together our messages. In addition to what you say, we want to think about who can deliver the message. So who delivers your message is just as important as what is being said. And messengers can be individuals, groups, or organizations. As with your message, your messenger can change depending on the decision maker you're targeting and their key interests. So it's important to think through key qualities of a good messenger for your decision maker on your topic. And so the 2 things that we like to consider are what is their influence with the decision maker? So do they have access to them? Are they seen as credible by the decision maker? And also, what is their expertise on the issue? You want a messenger who's informed and can speak about it easily. So here I have a list of all sorts of people who might at different times be a quality messenger for you. It could be someone prominent, like a CEO or a celebrity. You could also use health professionals, technical experts, coalition members or the head of a coalition, donors, journalists, politicians, all sorts of different messengers, and particularly you as an advocate. Consider when are you best placed to be the person delivering the message. And so I wanted to try and see if we could consider who might be the right messenger for our example that I presented earlier. So we have Minister Zaragamba is a member of parliament with limited awareness around my issue. She believes in a limited role for government. She's new to parliament. She's often persuaded by facts and evidence, and she subscribes to major newspapers but prefers in-person meetings with constituents. So knowing a bit about her beliefs and influences, as well as where she gets information, can help us determine the ideal messenger. So one last time, we're going to try and see if we can brainstorm here. Who might be the right messenger? So I've listed 3 there for us to consider: a patient, a technical expert from your organization, or a celebrity. And so here in the poll, you can see you get to choose kind of between low and high, 0 and 10, how much issue expertise a person will have and how much influence they might have. So you can kind of choose your own adventure. And we'll see. For each, so you'll rate for each of those 3 options, kind of, if you think they have a lot of influence with Zaragamba, it'll be higher, closer to a 10. And if they have a lot of issue expertise, also closer to a 10. Considering what we know. Okay. So it looks like kind of right now, folks who have weighed in, we're thinking maybe the patient has some influence, but a decent amount of issue expertise. We're a technical expert, a little bit more influence, a little bit more issue expertise. Our celebrity right now, maybe less expertise, less influence for our particular decision maker. And it looks like they've shifted just a little bit more, but that same general trend. So this is interesting to me because what we like to think about is the ideal messenger is going to be in that upper right quadrant, where both the patient and the technical expert currently are, to have kind of a good amount of influence and a good amount of expertise. And so I think one thing to consider is when choosing between those two, since they're both kind of in our sweet spot for where we would want a messenger to be, is are one or both of them constituents of the minister, because we know that she prefers in-person meetings with constituents. And so if both have some influence and both have some expertise, you might consider that as a key determining factor as well. So back to the slides here. This is, again, a worksheet that you can use just to kind of map out, as we just did. We like to list kind of some messengers that we're thinking about on the left-hand side, and then map them in the same way we just did in terms of their expertise and their influence. And then, again, ideally, your messenger ends up in that top right corner where they're most likely to have success. So in closing, I wanted to reiterate the 3 key points I made. 1, the best tactics are the ones that are most likely to have an immediate and direct impact on your target decision makers. We want to make sure we have an advocacy message that translates our goal into a concise and compelling case for a decision maker to act on. And then consider who delivers your message is just as important as what you have to say. And so craft a really great message and then determine who the ideal messenger for that situation is going to be. So thanks. This is helpful to me to kind of have this interactive opportunity. And if you're interested in more information, in addition to what's in the slides, I've listed the website here where you can find the workbook for how we usually walk through these things. It'll include the other 8 parts of the 10 parts series and worksheets and content that similar to what I've shared. And also at that website, you can find a bunch of our other materials on advocacy and case studies, briefs, that kind of thing that might trigger your own thinking about how you might message around your advocacy objective. So I think now I'm supposed to turn it back over to, yeah, great. I think
Well, thank you very much, Emma, for this very interesting and comprehensive webinar. Now, does anybody have questions for Emma? So please write in the little chat or ask for the presenter role. Well, if nobody has any questions, then we will thank Emma for this very interesting webinar, and thank you very much for attending. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.